He was the face of organized crime. A man feared by enemies, admired by followers, and hunted by the government. He built a criminal empire worth millions during the darkest, driest years of American Prohibition. But who was Al Capone, really? Was he a cold-blooded killer, a business mastermind, or something more complex? Today, we pull back the curtain on the man behind the myth, Alphonse Gabriel Capone. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York. He was the fourth of 9 children in an Italian immigrant family from Naples. His father, Gabriele Capone, was a barber. His mother, Teresa, a seamstress. They were honest, working-class people, chasing the American dream in a new, unforgiving city. But for young Al, the American dream took a darker turn. Brooklyn in the early 1900s was a tough place to grow up. Gangs ran the streets. Poverty was common. Schools were overcrowded and underfunded. Capone dropped out of school at the age of 14 after hitting a teacher. It wasn't long before the streets became his classroom, and crime his curriculum. Capone started small. He joined a local street gang called the 5 Points Gang, run by notorious mobster Johnny Torrio. Torrio saw potential in the young Capone, not just muscle, but intelligence, charisma, and fearlessness. It was during this time that Capone got his famous nickname, Scarface. A bar fight left him with 3 deep scars on his left cheek, but instead of hiding them, he wore them like a badge of honor. By his early 20s, Capone was already earning respect in the criminal underworld. Torrio eventually brought him to Chicago, a city on the brink of transformation. Prohibition had just begun, and with it came opportunity. In 1920, the U.S. government passed the Volstead Act, launching the Prohibition era. Alcohol became illegal, but Americans weren't ready to give it up, and gangsters like Capone were ready to cash in. Capone quickly climbed the ranks of Torrio's Chicago outfit. When Torrio retired after a near-death assassination attempt, he handed the empire to Capone. Al Capone, just 26 years old, became the most powerful mob boss in America. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a king, a ruler of a kingdom built on vice, violence, and vintage whiskey. But every king has enemies, and Capone's enemies were coming for blood. Before he ruled Chicago, Al Capone was just another street kid from Brooklyn. But even as a teenager, there was something different about him, something dangerous. Alphonse Capone grew up in a world where toughness meant survival. In the immigrant-heavy neighborhoods of Brooklyn, gang activity was a way of life, especially for boys who didn't fit into school or society. And Capone, he didn't just fit in with the gangs, he thrived in them. By the time he was a teenager, Capone had joined several street gangs, but none as influential as the 5 Points Gang, a notorious New York City crew that trained some of the most powerful criminals of the 20th century. Led by Paul Kelly, the gang had connections, money, and most importantly, muscle. Capone was mentored by Johnny Torrio, a man who would change his life forever. Working as a bouncer and bartender at the Harvard Inn in Coney Island, Capone made money, connections, and enemies. One night, he insulted a woman at the bar. Her brother slashed Capone's face with a knife, leaving him with 3 permanent scars. From that day forward, he was known as Scarface, a name he despised, but one the public never forgot. Still, the incident didn't slow him down. Capone continued rising through the ranks, doing enforcement work, running protection rackets, and showing a flair for both violence and organization. But his mentor, Johnny Torrio, saw bigger things for the young gangster. In 1919, Torrio called Capone to Chicago, where Prohibition was about to create the biggest black market the country had ever seen. Chicago wasn't just a bigger city, it was a battlefield. Politicians were corrupt, the police were underpaid, and rival gangs were ready to kill for territory. Torrio worked for mob boss Big Jim Colosimo, who ran prostitution and gambling operations. But when Torrio proposed moving into bootlegging, the illegal alcohol trade, Colosimo refused. He feared the attention it would bring. So, in 1920, Colosimo was gunned down in his own restaurant. The shooter was never identified, but many believed Torrio, with Capone's help, had him killed. With Colosimo out of the way, Torrio took control and began building a bootlegging empire. Capone was now his trusted lieutenant, and the alcohol business was booming. In a world where a glass of whiskey could get you arrested, Capone made sure you never had to drink alone. For a price. Capone brought more than muscle to the operation. He brought vision. He understood branding, public image, and loyalty. He paid well. He dressed impeccably, and unlike many gangsters, he made sure people loved him. To the poor, he was a Robin Hood. To his rivals, a nightmare. Throughout the early 1920s, Capone orchestrated everything from illegal breweries to distribution networks, bribing city officials, judges, and police officers to look the other way. But power came at a price. Rival gangs wanted a piece of the action, and turf wars broke out across Chicago. Bombings, drive-bys, executions in broad daylight. Then in 1925, Johnny Torrio was ambushed outside his home and nearly killed. The hit was ordered by a rival gang, and after surviving the attack, Torrio made a decision that would reshape history. He retired and left the entire empire in the hands of Al Capone, just 26 years old. A new king had risen, young, brutal, and brilliant, and he wasn't done yet. By 1925, Al Capone wasn't just a gangster, he was the boss. Johnny Torrio had stepped aside, and at only 26 years old, Capone was in command of the most powerful criminal organization in the Midwest. Chicago wasn't just his playground, it was his kingdom. At the heart of Capone's empire was alcohol. Prohibition had made liquor illegal, but it hadn't killed demand. Capone capitalized on this with ruthless efficiency. He operated an industrial-scale bootlegging operation. Illegal breweries pumped out thousands of gallons of beer and liquor every week. Trucks disguised as delivery vehicles transported alcohol across city lines. He even developed a distribution network more organized than some legitimate businesses of the time. Capone supplied hundreds of speakeasies, illegal bars hidden in plain sight. He had bartenders, musicians, and even local politicians on his payroll. But he didn't just rely on muscle. Capone treated crime like a business. He used accountants, lawyers, and layers of management. He diversified into gambling, prostitution, and extortion. His empire was estimated to earn over $100 million a year, an astronomical figure for the 1920s. Capone's control over Chicago wasn't just based on fear. It was built on influence. He had deep pockets and wasn't afraid to use them. Judges were bribed, cops were paid off. City officials turned a blind eye to his activities in exchange for envelopes stuffed with cash. One Chicago mayor was even rumored to have been elected with Capone's help. This network of protection allowed Capone to operate in broad daylight. He walked the streets like a celebrity, attended boxing matches, donated to charity, and dined at luxury hotels. The press loved him. To many, he was more than a criminal. He was a symbol of rebellion against an unpopular law. To the public, he was a paradox, a cold-blooded killer with a warm smile, a criminal mastermind who gave away Christmas turkeys to the poor. Behind the charm and tailored suits was a man who ruled with an iron fist. Capone understood that power had to be protected. When diplomacy failed, bullets followed. He employed a team of ruthless enforcers known as the Chicago Outfit, led by men like Frank Nitti and Jack Machine Gun McGurn. Rival gangs were eliminated, one by one. Territory was taken block by block. And when negotiations broke down, people disappeared, often permanently. The streets of Chicago became a war zone, shootouts in broad daylight, bombings of rival businesses. Even innocent bystanders weren't always spared. But Capone's most infamous act of violence was still to come. Despite his violent reputation, Capone knew the power of public relations. He often staged charitable events, gave generously to local communities, and even opened one of the first soup kitchens during the Great Depression. He claimed to be a businessman, not a criminal, and played the part well. In his personal life, Capone was surprisingly reserved. He married May Coughlin in 1918, and they had one child, Sonny Capone. Though surrounded by violence, Capone tried to keep his family insulated from his criminal world. Still, paranoia crept in. He traveled with armed bodyguards, rarely stayed in the same place for long, and behind the confident grin was a man constantly looking over his shoulder. Capone's dominance didn't come without resistance. Several powerful gangs operated in Chicago, including the North Side Gang, led by Irish mobster George Bugs Moran. Moran refused to bow to Capone's control, and their rivalry turned Chicago into a battleground. Each side launched hits against the other. Warehouses were raided, friends were betrayed. Bombings became part of daily life in gangland Chicago. Capone, ever the tactician, responded with a mix of diplomacy and terror. But by 1929, he decided it was time to end the North Side problem, once and for all. He had the money, the muscle, the city in the palm of his hand. But even kings can be challenged, and Capone was ready to send a message the whole world would hear. That message would become one of the bloodiest moments in organized crime history. Al Capone didn't rule Chicago by accident. He ruled it through a perfect storm of fear, money, and brilliant manipulation. He didn't just run the underworld, he bent the city itself to his will. Capone understood something most gangsters didn't. Fear is power, but controlled fear is empire. He didn't need to kill everyone who crossed him. Just a few in the most brutal, public ways possible. That was enough to keep the rest in line. One of his most chilling tactics was using public executions. Enemies were gunned down in the streets, in restaurants, even in their homes. Sometimes, their bodies were left where the public could see them. A message written in blood. And when violence wasn't enough, he used intimidation. Jurors were threatened, witnesses vanished, competitors were offered deals they couldn't refuse, and knew better than to try. While fear was effective on the streets, Capone needed something more to protect his empire from law enforcement, control from the inside. Capone's organization funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into bribing politicians, police chiefs, judges, and even federal agents. His reach went from the gutters to the government. He placed spies in police stations. He knew when raids were coming and had time to move or hide operations. In some cases, raids were staged for show, with law enforcement paid to make a scene, seize worthless evidence, then disappear. No case against Capone stuck. No jury dared convict him. He walked through a city of laws as if they didn't apply to him, because in many ways, they didn't. In a city filled with laws, Capone didn't break them. He bought them. Capone wasn't just a thug with a gun. He was a strategist with a vision. He kept detailed records of his profits and expenses. He organized his gang like a corporate hierarchy, with departments handling everything from liquor to gambling to enforcement. He rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal. He didn't trust many, but those he did were fiercely loyal. He also understood branding before it was a buzzword. He dressed in expensive suits, drove luxury cars, and appeared at public events as if he were a celebrity, not a criminal. The media couldn't get enough of him. Newspapers ran stories calling him the Robin Hood of Chicago. Children waved when he passed. People saw him as a man of the people, because Capone made sure they did. By 1929, Capone's war with rival gangster George "Bugs" Moran reached its boiling point. On February 14th, 1929, Capone made his most infamous move, one that would shock the nation and forever stain his name in blood. That morning, 7 members of Moran's gang were lined up against the wall inside a North Side garage and executed by men posing as police officers. The killers used Tommy guns. The floor was soaked in blood. Capone was in Florida at the time, far from the crime scene, but everyone knew who sent the message. It was a massacre, cold, calculated, unforgettable. And it marked a turning point, because after that day, the press no longer loved Capone. They feared him, and the government finally decided enough was enough. But behind the polished image, Capone was falling apart. He suffered from neurosyphilis, a disease that slowly ate away at his brain. He became increasingly erratic, paranoid, and impulsive. His temper worsened. His decision-making faltered. Inside, the King of Chicago was unraveling, and the federal government was watching. They couldn't tie him to murders. They couldn't pin bootlegging on him directly. But someone had found a weakness. Taxes. The most powerful gangster in America was about to be brought down by a bookkeeper. For nearly a decade, Al Capone laughed in the face of justice. He killed with impunity, bribed judges, owned police departments. He seemed untouchable. But in the shadows, a different kind of weapon was being sharpened. Not a gun, but a ledger. And the man who would take Capone down wore a suit, not a badge. Capone's empire was vast, violent, and profitable. But it also left a paper trail. While Prohibition agents struggled to catch Capone in the act of selling alcohol or ordering murders, a new strategy emerged: follow the money. The Treasury Department's Special Intelligence Unit, later known as the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, began digging into Capone's finances. Leading the charge was Frank J. Wilson, a quiet, methodical agent with a deadly focus. Wilson and his team searched through thousands of financial records, seized ledgers, and interviewed witnesses who had handled Capone's money, bartenders, bookkeepers, front men. Their goal? Tax evasion. Capone never filed a tax return, never claimed income, but everyone knew he lived like a millionaire. And under U.S. law, illegal income was still taxable. In 1929, Capone made a crucial mistake. He was summoned to a federal grand jury for tax-related questioning. Rather than appear, he claimed illness, but then was photographed in California attending horse races. The government pounced. He was arrested for contempt of court and briefly jailed. The message was clear. His invincibility was cracking. Around the same time, Prohibition agent Eliot Ness began targeting Capone's bootlegging operations directly. Ness and his team, dubbed the Untouchables, launched dozens of raids, seizing breweries and intercepting shipments. While Ness couldn't link Capone to murder, he achieved something critical. He crippled his revenue. The king's fortune was bleeding, and behind closed doors, he knew it. On June 5th, 1931, the federal government unveiled its master stroke. Capone was indicted on 22 counts of federal income tax evasion. Weeks later, they added 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act, the law enforcing prohibition. But the tax charges were the main weapon, because unlike murder or extortion, they didn't require eyewitnesses, just math. Capone's lawyers tried to negotiate. He offered to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, but the judge rejected it. This time, there would be no backroom deals. The trial was set for October, and the U.S. government wasn't taking any chances. United States versus Alphonse Capone began on October 6, 1931. Capone arrived in court looking calm, dressed in a tailored suit, confident his bribes would deliver a favorable outcome. But the judge pulled a bold move. He swapped out the jury at the last minute, preventing any tampering. Over 2 weeks, the prosecution presented a meticulous case. Financial experts traced Capone's income, showing he had spent millions while reporting nothing. Witnesses testified. Documents piled up. Capone's defense was weak. He claimed he was just a gambler, not a criminal boss. The jury didn't buy it. He didn't lose control with bullets, but with books. On October 17th, 1931, the verdict came in. Guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. Sentence: 11 years in federal prison. It was the harshest penalty for tax crimes in American history. Capone's fall was dramatic. He went from 5-star suites to a cell in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. But even behind bars, he tried to maintain power, bribing guards, securing special privileges. That changed in 1934, when he was transferred to the newly opened Alcatraz, the island prison designed for America's worst. There, Capone found no allies, no favors, and no escape. His mental and physical health deteriorated rapidly. The effects of syphilis ravaged his brain. He grew paranoid, delusional, often confused. Inmates said he sometimes talked to people who weren't there. He reportedly spent hours playing his banjo alone in the prison showers. In 1939, Capone was released early due to his failing health. He was just 40 years old, but had the mind of a man in his 80s. He retired to a mansion in Palm Island, Florida, a ghost of the man he once was. No more power, no more empire, just a name that had once terrified a nation. On January 25th, 1947, Al Capone died of cardiac arrest, brought on by complications of neurosyphilis. He was 48. The man who ruled Chicago with blood and bourbon died with no crown, no soldiers, no throne, but even now, nearly a century later, his name echoes, not just in crime history, but in the myth of American power. Al Capone has been dead for nearly 80 years, but his legend, it never really died. In fact, in many ways, it only grew. Capone didn't invent organized crime, but he refined it. He built a criminal corporation unlike anything America had seen. He managed territories like markets. He used accountants, lawyers, enforcers, and PR tactics. His gang wasn't just thugs with Tommy guns. It was a machine designed for profit and survival. Today, his methods are studied by law enforcement and criminals alike. From drug cartels to corporate fraud, Capone's playbook remains shockingly relevant. He taught the underworld how to think like businessmen and taught business how to act like gangsters. After his death, Capone transformed from villain to cultural icon. Hollywood couldn't get enough of him. He inspired dozens of films, from Scarface, 1932, The Untouchables, 1987. He was portrayed by actors like Robert De Niro, Tom Hardy, or Ben Gazzara, each adding new layers to the myth. Books, documentaries, TV shows, even comic books, all reimagined Capone in different ways. The ruthless killer, the gentleman gangster, the tragic figure, the American anti-hero. This constant reinvention blurred the lines between fact and fiction. To many, Capone isn't history. He's a symbol. Capone's downfall by tax evasion remains one of the most ironic moments in American justice. It sent a message to future criminals. No one is above the law, not even the most feared man in America. And sometimes, justice comes not with guns, but with paperwork. Today, the IRS still uses the Capone case as a teaching tool. It's a story of how patience, precision, and law outsmarted violence and fear. You can walk through Chicago today and never see his name, but you'll feel his shadow. But beneath the myth lies something darker. Capone's rise was built on blood. Over 500 gangland murders took place during his reign. Families were torn apart, innocents caught in crossfire, justice delayed, lives shattered. His story may be captivating, even cinematic, but it came with a price, one paid by countless people who never made the headlines. For every legend, there are victims who never became famous, just forgotten. In the end, Al Capone's story isn't just about a gangster. It's about consequences. For every mansion he built, there was a family left grieving. For every dollar he made, a life was lost. For every headline he owned, there was someone silenced. He may have become a legend, but he also became a warning.